December 17, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The dawn air hung thick with fog and fear. In a frozen foxhole, Obergefreiter Hans Müller clutched a small diary, his handwriting trembling from cold and dread. His words would echo through time. The Americans are not like the Russians. Their artillery is something else entirely. It is not the volume, though, that is terrible enough. It is the speed. It is the accuracy. It is the knowledge that you have no time to react. That morning, deep in the snow-covered woods, Müller's unit, part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, was convinced victory was finally within reach. Hitler's last gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. The Germans had achieved total surprise, crashing into thinly held American lines. For a fleeting moment, it felt as if the Third Reich could still change the course of the war. Then, the American artillery found them, and everything changed. What Müller could not have known was that he and thousands of others were facing the most sophisticated artillery system ever fielded in human history, a system born not from desperation or ideology, but from the cold precision of mathematics, logistics, and industrial genius. Within hours, the forest that had promised victory became a tomb. Throughout 1943 and 1944, as German veterans transferred from the collapsing Eastern Front to face American forces in Italy and France, they carried with them a set of assumptions. They had endured the massive, chaotic barrages of Soviet guns, terrifying but predictable. Soviet artillery would range targets slowly, allowing veterans time to take cover. Firing was often inaccurate, its rhythm discernible. In contrast, the Americans struck like a thunderclap, no ranging shots, no warning, only devastation that arrived all at once. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, a veteran of 2 years on the Eastern Front, experienced that shock firsthand in Tunisia. Captured later by the Allies, he recalled, "We had taken cover in a wadi north of Tunis. Good cover, we thought. The Russians would have needed an hour to find us. We felt safe enough to heat our coffee. Then we saw it, a tiny aircraft circling above. We thought nothing of it. 3 minutes later, without warning, the wadi erupted. In half a minute, my company ceased to exist. The aircraft was not a bomber. It was a Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a lightweight observation plane carrying a single forward observer. Unarmed, slow, almost comically fragile. Yet to German troops, its appearance became a death sentence. Whenever the Grasshopper appeared, they knew destruction would follow within minutes. This synergy between air observation and artillery fire represented a revolutionary leap in warfare, one that merged intelligence communication and precision in a way the world had never seen. As post-war analyses by Rand and the U.S. Army War College later noted, the American system did not rely merely on firepower, but on information speed. It was, in effect, an early form of network-centric warfare, a concept that would not be formally articulated until half a century later. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, a seasoned German artillery officer, once believed Allied documents describing such coordination were mere propaganda. No army, he thought, could compute trajectories, wind speeds, temperatures, and firing corrections across dozens of batteries so rapidly. But near Signan, France, he saw it himself. Before we could even compute our counter-battery data, shells were already falling on our position. Not random, not area fire, but precise. Each gun hit as if someone had drawn a circle around it on a map. The secret behind this terrifying precision was not a single invention, but an entire system, the Fire Direction Center (FDC). While German batteries operated independently, each calculating its own data, American FDCs centralized that process. Dozens of guns could be coordinated to strike a single grid square, all firing according to pre-calculated tables. And those tables The mathematical backbone of the American artillery machine had been produced long before the soldiers ever saw combat. In cities like Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Chicago, rooms full of women known as computers worked tirelessly with slide rules and mechanical calculators, producing firing data for every conceivable variable: air temperature, altitude, humidity, barrel wear, propellant heat, and even geographic latitude. Every variable that could shift a shell's trajectory was accounted for. These volumes of data compressed into pocket-sized field manuals allowed American officers to call in accurate fire within minutes. Dr. Helmut Werner Hoffmann, a German mathematics professor conscripted into the Wehrmacht artillery, later examined captured American firing tables. His conclusion, preserved in post-war archives, was candid. They had done the mathematics in advance. In the field, they simply looked up the answer. But the tables alone did not explain the devastation. The true revolution was something the U.S. Army called time on target, or TOT. The concept was deceptively simple, but extraordinarily difficult to execute. Shells fired from batteries at varying distances were timed so precisely that they struck their target within a 3-second window, arriving simultaneously, creating the illusion of a single instantaneous explosion across an entire area. To soldiers on the receiving end, there was no warning. There were no ranging shots, no gradual crescendo of fire. Just silence and then annihilation. Post-war U.S. Army studies confirmed that nearly 2/3 of all artillery casualties occurred in the first seconds of a barrage. TOT exploited that fact perfectly. One German diary recovered from the battlefield near Bastogne captured the experience in haunting clarity. It is not artillery as we understood it. You hear nothing. Then the world ends. Every shell arrives together. The air bursts kill those who would survive ground bursts. There is no time to drop flat, no time even to breathe. What made such precision possible was America's communications infrastructure. By 1944, U.S. forces had deployed thousands of FM radios, frequency-modulated transmitters, that provided crystal-clear, interference-free contact. German forces still reliant on AM radios struggled with static and unreliable signals. Every American infantry battalion carried multiple forward observer radios. Many German units had just one, if any. The result was a profound asymmetry in command responsiveness. American observers could request support in seconds. German officers often waited 10 minutes or an hour. In modern military theory, this is known as the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act. American artillery compressed that loop so drastically that the enemy's decision cycle collapsed entirely. This speed turned artillery into more than a support arm. It became a strategic weapon. A single American forward observer could summon a barrage equivalent to a small airstrike often faster than aircraft could respond. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a German officer in Normandy, lamented after the war. A single American company surrounded in a village held my regiment for 6 hours. Every time we tried to advance, artillery stopped us. It was as if the earth itself rebelled against our movement. Behind every shell lay not just firepower, but an entire industrial civilization in motion. America's Rock Island arsenal, operating at maximum capacity, produced thousands of 105mm howitzers each, a masterpiece of engineering manufactured to tight tolerances that ensured interchangeability and reliability. Every U.S. infantry division carried 36 of these guns organized into motorized battalions. They could displace, refire, and reposition in less than 30 minutes, a feat that left German horse-drawn artillery hopelessly outmatched. In post-war assessments by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, analysts noted that roughly 80% of German artillery still relied on horses by late 1944. For every sleek American truck towing a gun, The Wehrmacht needed teams of animals trudging through snow and mud. The gap was not just mechanical, it was civilizational. In these forests, the clash between 19th century logistics and 20th century industrial warfare played out with brutal clarity. One side moved with steel and fuel, the other with hooves and muscle. When the Americans fired, they brought to bear the full weight of the modern age. The Battle of the Bulge would prove it beyond doubt. Within days, the myth of German invincibility was shattered, not by tanks or aircraft, but by mathematics coordination and a kind of mechanical inevitability that no human courage could resist. The world had entered the age of systemized destruction, an era where the efficiency of computation, not just bravery, determined survival. By the winter of 1944, the United States had turned the science of artillery into a symphony of coordination and calculation. What the Germans once dismissed as mass fire without finesse became in truth an orchestration of industrial genius and military precision. Each gun was a note, each firing table a sheet of music, and the fire direction center its conductor. The Americans had built not just better guns, but an entirely new philosophy of warfare. Their artillery doctrine was born from the idea that speed and synchronization mattered more than size or even range. It wasn't the biggest gun that won. It was the one that could strike first strike accurately and strike everywhere at once. While German artillery officers prided themselves on individual skill calculating trajectories by hand and relying on intuition honed over years, the Americans replaced intuition with data, talent with system, and experience with process. As a Rand military historian later wrote, the Americans industrialized precision. The U.S. Army's 105mm M2A1 howitzer became the backbone of this system. Weighing over 2 tons, it could fire a 15-kilogram shell nearly 7 miles with astonishing accuracy. But its true strength lay not in the weapon itself, but in how it was used. Every U.S. division deployed 3 full battalions, 36 guns in total, each connected through a network of radios and centralized fire direction. The moment a forward observer spotted a target, dozens of guns could shift aim and fire within minutes. This interconnectedness, the seamless flow of information from scout plane to ground observer to FDC to battery, was decades ahead of its time. In today's terms, it would be called a real-time sensor-to-shooter network, the foundation of modern precision warfare. For the Germans who had spent years mastering the art of decentralized control, this centralization was incomprehensible. They saw in American artillery a kind of machine-like inevitability. "It is not a duel," wrote Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer. "It is an execution." But even this remarkable efficiency paled in comparison to what would come next, the revolution of mobility. While German gunners still relied on horses to haul their 105mm F-18 howitzers through mud and snow, American batteries were fully motorized. Trucks and half-tracks could tow their guns at highway speeds displaced within half an hour and be ready to fire again before German units had even limbered theirs. Paul Richter, a German artilleryman in Normandy, recorded the humiliation in his diary. "We fired one mission, and by the time we had our horses hitched to move their trucks, were already bringing in fresh guns. They fought a 20th century war. We fought one from the last century." This gap in mobility proved fatal. In warfare, the ability to move is the ability to survive. German batteries that took 2 hours to relocate were obliterated by American counter-battery fire in 20 minutes. In military academies today, this principle is codified as the tempo advantage, the ability to act, adapt, and re-engage faster than your opponent. The U.S. artillery speed granted it near total dominance. Yet even with superior coordination and mobility, something still limited artillery's potential: the human factor. Timing calculations and range estimations were subject to error, especially in complex terrain. That changed forever with the advent of a technological marvel, the variable time fuse or VT fuse. The VT fuse was nothing short of revolutionary, a miniature radar built into the nose of an artillery shell. As it approached the ground or any object, it emitted radio waves that reflected back to the shell, triggering detonation at the perfect altitude, usually 10 to 20 meters above ground. The result was an explosion suspended in air-raining fragments over a wide area with deadly precision. Unlike traditional timed fuses, which required precise manual settings and often misfired due to wind or barrel wear, the VT fuse was self-adjusting. It worked flawlessly regardless of weather or temperature. The concept had first been tested at sea. In early 1943, the USS Helena used VT-fused shells to shoot down a Japanese dive bomber with only 3 salvos, an achievement that astonished naval commanders. From that moment, it became clear whoever controlled this technology would dominate the battlefield. But for nearly 2 years, its use was restricted to naval and anti-aircraft operations. The fear that unexploded shells might fall into enemy hands and reveal the secret delayed its deployment on land. It wasn't until General Dwight D. Eisenhower personally intervened during the Battle of the Bulge that the Pentagon finally approved it for ground use. His reasoning was simple: survival. American troops were under immense pressure, and the Germans were advancing fast. The risk of losing the VT secret was outweighed by the risk of losing the war's momentum. On December 19, 1944, authorization came through. Within days, German troops began to call the new shells Demon Rain. The effect was immediate and horrifying. Foxholes that once offered safety now became traps. Soldiers who had trained all their lives to hit the ground at the first sound of incoming fire found themselves dying where they lay. The fragments came vertically slicing through thin helmets and snowbanks alike. Hans Müller, the same German soldier whose diary opened this story, survived one such barrage and described it later. We had learned on the Eastern Front to flatten ourselves. But these shells, these cursed shells, exploded above us. The fragments fell like rain. No cover was enough. We simply died. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Army estimated that VT fuses increased artillery lethality by up to 700%. In practice, that meant a single American battery could achieve the same destructive power, once requiring an entire regiment. Modern historians often cite the atomic bomb as the technological symbol of World War II. But among military professionals, it was the VT fuse that truly changed ground warfare. As RAND analysts later observed, it transformed artillery from a blunt instrument into a scalpel of mass destruction. Its psychological impact was just as devastating as its physical one. German morale, already fraying under constant bombardment, broke entirely. Orders to attack were refused. Entire companies refused to move, preferring surrender to certain death under the unseen storm. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer recorded one such moment in his final letter. The men would not rise from their trenches. They had seen what American artillery does in the open. No order, no courage could move them. By the late winter of 1944, the U.S. Army's artillery had achieved what military theorists once deemed impossible: a perfect fusion of science, industry, and combat. Every shell was a product of data, every battery a component in a national machine, every firing mission a demonstration that the American way of war was no longer improvisational. It was algorithmic. Even before the war ended, Allied intelligence officers began to realize the scale of what had been accomplished. The fusion of centralized command, industrial computation, and real-time observation had set the blueprint for post-war warfare. The lesson was clear: in the modern era, dominance would belong not to the bravest, but to the best organized. In the snows of the Ardennes, As the thunder of the guns rolled across the forest, the German soldiers who had once believed in the superiority of their training and discipline now faced an enemy whose strength came from something deeper, a nation's total mastery of industrial war. By early 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had revealed a truth too immense for Germany to conceal or rationalize. The vaunted Wehrmacht, the force that had conquered Europe in 3 years, was no longer fighting an army of men, but an army of systems. American artillery had become more than a weapon. It was an ecosystem, industrial, computational, and psychological, all functioning with the precision of a single organism. At the heart of that organism was a principle no propaganda could counterscale. The United States did not just field superior artillery, it produced it in quantities that defied comprehension. Rock Island Arsenal alone manufactured more than 8 500 M2A1 105mm howitzers by war's end. Across the nation, assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, under the rhythm of what economists later called the arsenal of democracy. Each gun rolled off the line identical to the last, its parts interchangeable, its tolerances exact. In the chaos of battle, this uniformity was a weapon in itself. Damaged guns could be repaired with parts from any other unit. Ammunition fit universally. Training manuals matched equipment from coast to coast. A lieutenant in France could read the same firing tables as a corporal in the Philippines. It was warfare by standardization, an approach that multiplied efficiency as effectively as it multiplied firepower. In contrast, German production resembled a mosaic of brilliance and chaos. Artillery factories scattered across occupied Europe built weapons of superb design but incompatible models. Fuses varied from one batch to another. Ammunition differed slightly between factories. German officers often discovered that shells from one supplier wouldn't fit the guns of another. What had once been a sign of craftsmanship, customized precision, had become a liability. By 1944, Germany was producing 1/1000th the artillery ammunition the United States was manufacturing monthly. Rand's post-war economic studies revealed that American artillery production was so abundant that logistics officers deliberately imposed ration limits during the Bulge, not because of shortage, but to prevent overconsumption. Even with those restrictions, more than 1.2 million shells were fired during the 6-week campaign. For German gunners, whose weekly allotment could be as low as 50 rounds per gun, this imbalance was fatal. Lieutenant Werner Vogel wrote bitterly in his diary, "We fight a poor man's war against a rich man's enemy. I must justify every shell I fire. The Americans fire thousands without hesitation." Behind the American supply lines lay the machinery of modern capitalism itself. Standardized contracts, automated logistics, and a transportation system that had become the envy of the industrialized world. Truck convoys, coordinated by radio, moved ammunition across Europe in an endless loop. Each truck was tracked, scheduled, and resupplied like a cog in a grand industrial mechanism. German logistics, by contrast, were trapped in a pre-industrial nightmare. The majority of German artillery was horse-drawn, a detail the Nazi propaganda machine carefully obscured from the public. Even in 1945, more than 1 million horses served in the Wehrmacht, straining through mud and snow to drag field guns designed for paved roads. Horses starved faster than they could be replaced. When the Americans destroyed the bridges and rail lines, the German supply system collapsed. Ammunition rotted in rear depots unreachable. As Allied air power shredded Germany's rail network, the disparity widened into catastrophe. American batteries never ran dry. German ones fell silent. By February, the situation was so dire that some German divisions were allocated just 2 shells per gun per day, barely enough for ranging fire. This logistical starvation transformed German tactics. Artillery, once the Wehrmacht's pride, became an afterthought. Commanders stopped planning massed bombardments and began hoarding shells for emergencies. American units, by contrast, integrated artillery into every movement. Even minor skirmishes were supported by coordinated fire missions that would have required full-scale preparation in any other army. Military theorists at Rand later called this the democratization of firepower. In previous wars, artillery was the weapon of generals' mass fire controlled from the top. In the U.S. Army, it became the weapon of lieutenants. A single forward observer could summon the might of an entire corps within minutes. This decentralization of destruction was revolutionary. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a German observer during the Normandy campaign, described the frustration of waiting for support that never came. "I called for corps artillery at 0915. The enemy was massing tanks. Fire arrived 4 hours later. By then, the Americans had withdrawn. The shells fell on empty ground." That story repeated across France, Belgium, and the Ardennes. By the time German artillery responded, the Americans had already advanced or relocated. Every delay in the German chain of command widened the gap. Technology deepened it further. The Americans' FM radio network provided clear, real-time communication between infantry observers and batteries. Even in the dense forests of Belgium, signals carried with minimal interference. German units using AM transmitters suffered constant static cross-channel interference and equipment failure. This difference might seem technical, but its implications were existential. Communication speed meant decision speed, and decision speed meant survival. The faster army doesn't just shoot. First, it defines the tempo of battle. The result was a phenomenon German soldiers began calling the thunder that moves. They described it as if the artillery itself was alive, rolling with the infantry, shifting positions, adapting to terrain. They could never predict where the next barrage would come from because the Americans were never static. One German war correspondent reporting from the shattered outskirts of Bastogne wrote in despair, "We no longer fight against men. We fight against their machines, their radios, their endless shells. The earth shakes not once, but forever." As 1945 began, the U.S. artillery's superiority reached near total dominance. Corps-level batteries fielded 150mm guns, 8-inch howitzers, and even the massive 240mm siege guns, weapons capable of reducing fortifications that once required weeks of assault. A single rifle company under fire could now summon destruction on a scale previously reserved for entire armies. These weapons were not simply more powerful, they were integrated. The same forward observer who commanded a 105mm battery could within minutes redirect the fire of divisional or corps-level guns. This pyramiding of firepower ensured that American forces could scale their response instantly from skirmish to annihilation. The Germans, bound by rigid hierarchy, could not match this flexibility. Their divisional artillery answered to division command, corps artillery to corps command. Requests for coordination climbed through multiple echelons, delayed by paperwork, intercepted messages, or lost horses. When the shells finally came, the war had already moved on. Even among the Allies, this efficiency was recognized as uniquely American. British officers in post-war debriefings admitted with admiration and a hint of disbelief that U.S. artillery fire could be requested, calculated, and executed in less time than it took a British observer to finish his report. The war correspondent Ernie Pyle, embedded with the U.S. First Army, once called American gunners the gods of thunder. He wasn't exaggerating. And as those guns thundered across Europe, they announced something far larger than battlefield supremacy. They heralded the beginning of a new global order. The United States had demonstrated not just how to win a war, but how to manufacture victory. Through data organization and limitless industrial power, It had forged a template for modern military dominance, efficient, scalable, and terrifyingly precise. In the Ardennes, German soldiers learned that lesson the hard way. For them, American artillery wasn't simply fire, it was inevitability. The collapse of the German offensive in the Ardennes was not a single battle lost. It was the unraveling of an entire military philosophy. For years, the Wehrmacht had prided itself on tactical brilliance, flexibility, and initiative qualities that had once defined blitzkrieg. But against American artillery, these virtues were rendered useless. No maneuver could outflank a weapon that reached everywhere at once, and no courage could overcome a system built to erase human reaction itself. By late December 1944, the frozen forests of Belgium echoed day and night with the relentless cadence of U.S. guns. Even during temporary ammunition restrictions, such as the 10-round limit per gun imposed at Bastogne, the accuracy and coordination of American fire remained overwhelming. Every attempt by German infantry or armor to mass for an assault drew immediate counterfire. Tanks burned before they could advance. Infantry companies vanished in clouds of snow and smoke. The statistics were staggering. During the 6-week Ardennes campaign, over 4,000 American artillery pieces fired more than 1.25 million shells. Analysts from the U.S. Army Center of Military History would later conclude that artillery inflicted over half of all German casualties during the battle. General Omar Bradley famously remarked, "The artillery won the Battle of the Bulge." Inside the German lines, despair spread faster than orders. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose diary was captured in a command post near Saint-Vith, described the chaos. "We fired our mission in support of the infantry. Within minutes, counter-battery fire destroyed 3 of our 6 guns. The horses were killed. We tried to move the rest, but without horses they were useless. We abandoned them and fled through the snow." This pattern repeated across the front. German batteries immobilized and undersupplied were systematically erased by American counterfire. Entire regiments found themselves defenseless, unable to respond. The U.S. guns, fueled by efficient logistics and a ceaseless flow of ammunition, never went silent. Even during the fiercest weather, when Allied aircraft were grounded, American artillery filled the void. The Germans had gambled on fog and cloud cover to neutralize air power, but they had forgotten that artillery doesn't need sunlight. Rand's later analysis would call this the strategic blind spot of the Ardennes offensive. In choosing terrain and weather that negated Allied air superiority, the German command had unintentionally favored the one American weapon unaffected by either. The moment the skies cleared after Christmas, U.S. air and artillery merged into a synchronized killing machine. Fighter bombers attacked supply lines while artillery pounded troop concentrations with mathematical precision. German formations caught between them disintegrated. The once proud 6th SS Panzer Army, Hitler's elite strike force, was reduced to fragments, its survivors stumbling westward through shattered villages and burning woods. In one of his final reports before capture, Oberst Heinrich Müller wrote bitterly, "We were defeated by artillery before we were defeated by infantry or armor. Every movement was observed, every assembly dispersed, every position obliterated. We could not mass, we could not defend. We simply ceased to exist." The Battle of the Bulge had been intended to split the Allied front and force a negotiated peace. Instead, it exposed the full extent of Germany's collapse militarily, industrially, and psychologically. The Americans' industrial capacity was not merely an advantage, it was a revelation of what total mobilization in a democratic society could achieve. In the span of 4 years, the United States had built an artillery network so vast that it blurred the line between military and factory. Every gun crew was the endpoint of an industrial process that began in Chicago, Detroit, or Pittsburgh. Every barrage was the audible proof of national organization operating at planetary scale. This convergence of science production and war was a triumph of systems thinking. Historians would later call it the mechanization of coordination, the idea that human decision-making could be replaced or accelerated by standardized processes. In essence, America had automated victory. The human cost for Germany was devastating. Diaries recovered from the ruins of the Western Front tell stories not only of destruction, but of mental collapse. Soldiers began refusing to leave bunkers, convinced that any open ground meant instant death. A company near Houffalize refused direct orders to attack after witnessing an entire neighboring regiment annihilated by VT-fused shells. One officer recorded, "The men preferred capture to certain death under the sky." Eisenhower himself noted in his post-war memoirs that the psychological effect of the proximity fuse was out of all proportion to its physical power. German troops could no longer predict how to survive. Traditional instincts seek cover. Dig deep, stay low, no longer applied. The sky had turned into the enemy. In Washington, data from the Bulge confirmed what U.S. Army ordnance had long believed. Proximity fuses increased artillery effectiveness by an average of 400%, with lethal fragmentation zones expanding to over 3,000 square feet per shell. The impact was so great that General George Marshall described it as second only to the atomic bomb in technological significance. But the VT fuse was only part of a larger story, the story of what economists later called industrial overmatch. American factories didn't merely supply the front, they drowned it in abundance. In 1944 alone, U.S. industry produced over 10,000 heavy howitzers, 38 million artillery shells, and 100 million fuses. By comparison, Germany's entire 1944 artillery output, including all calibers, was roughly equal to 6 weeks of American production. This disparity made a mockery of any tactical brilliance the Wehrmacht still possessed. A German artillery officer might plot the perfect counterstrike, but with 2 shells left in his battery theory no longer mattered. The consequences rippled through every level of command. German generals, once masters of maneuver warfare, were forced into static defense. They could not move without being destroyed, could not mass without being annihilated. The very doctrines that had once defined German strength became suicide under American fire. When Allied forces captured the diaries of Lieutenant Bauer and Professor Hoffman in early 1945, intelligence analysts realized they were reading not just battlefield observations, but confessions of defeat. Hoffman, the mathematician who had studied American firing tables, wrote one final note for his captors. The Americans have transformed the art of artillery into an industrial process. They no longer rely on genius, but on systems. They have removed the uncertainty of war. That statement would later echo through post-war military theory. At RAND, the emerging field of operations research drew directly from these lessons. Analysts studying the efficiency of American artillery in the European theater began to apply the same mathematics to economics, logistics, and nuclear strategy. The Fire Direction Center became a metaphor for centralized command and control in modern warfare. And so, the U.S. artillery did more than win battles, it reshaped how the world understood war itself. The combination of pre-computed data, rapid communication, and industrial output became the template for 20th century power projection. From Korea to the Persian Gulf, its legacy would endure precision through process dominance, through coordination. In 1945, as the snow melted over the Ardennes, the shattered remnants of the German army stumbled eastward. Chased by thunder, they could neither outrun nor comprehend. The war that had begun with lightning blitzkrieg was ending with thunder, the calculated, relentless rhythm of American guns. By the final months of the war, the once mighty Wehrmacht had become a shadow of its former self. The artillery that had roared across Poland and France now sputtered in fragments. Half its guns destroyed its supply lines, strangled. What remained of German firepower was scattered among improvised batteries short on ammunition, shorter still on men. In the Ruhr and the Rhineland, where the last great battles of the Western Front unfolded, the imbalance between American and German artillery reached almost absurd proportions. U.S. divisions fully supplied and motorized advanced behind curtain barrages so dense that German survivors described them as walls of air made solid by fire. Every ridge, every crossroads, every suspected tree line was pre-registered in the American fire plans. The moment a German unit was detected by sound radio or aerial spotting, thunder answered. A captured report from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division in March 1945 summed up the experience. Movement is impossible by day. Even single trucks attract fire. We have ceased to think of artillery as a supporting weapon of the enemy. It is omnipresent. It is their main arm. And indeed, by this stage, American artillery had transcended its original role. It was no longer just the king of battle, but the architect of victory, a weapon system whose integration of observation, coordination, and computation foreshadowed the digital age. At the operational level, the transformation was breathtaking. A single corps headquarters could direct hundreds of guns across multiple divisions, each battery linked by FM radio to a central fire direction center capable of computing corrections for weather trajectory and range in real time. The effect was an artillery web, elastic, omnidirectional, and instantaneous. When the Ninth Army crossed the Rhine in March 1945, over 1,200 guns supported the bridgehead at Remagen. American gunners fired so continuously that barrels glowed red, and logistics officers had to schedule rest periods for trucks hauling shells. The German counterattacks that followed were annihilated before they could deploy. Prisoner interrogations later confirmed that many units never even saw an American soldier. They were destroyed entirely by fire. As RAND's post-war analysts would later note, this represented the first fully realized example of networked warfare, the seamless linking of sensors' command and firepower into one responsive system. What the Germans experienced as terror was, in technical terms, the perfection of process. In the years that followed, U.S. military theorists would refine this into doctrine. Time on target. Once a battlefield innovation became standard procedure across NATO armies. Fire direction centers evolved into computerized command posts. The principles forged in the Ardennes, the compression of decision time, the centralization of data, the synchronization of dispersed units, became the template for Cold War strategy, and eventually, for modern joint operations. But in 1945, those ideas were still born in blood and smoke. For the Germans on the ground, the scale of destruction was incomprehensible. In the Ruhr pocket, Professor Helmut Werner Hoffmann, the same mathematician who had once analyzed American firing tables, was finally captured. His last report to his superiors, written just days before, surrender read almost like an obituary for an entire way of war. The American artillery system represents the culmination of the industrial age of warfare. They have applied the methods of mass production logistics and standardized training to every aspect of combat. Individual skill cannot match industrial process. Where we rely on excellence, they rely on system, and the system always prevails. Hoffmann's insight was prophetic. The shift he described was not merely military, it was civilizational. The United States had discovered that the same principles driving its factories, railroads, and assembly lines could be applied to the battlefield. Efficiency itself had become a weapon. German officers, now prisoners in camps from Texas to Virginia, saw this transformation firsthand. They watched endless trains of artillery pieces move toward the ports, each identical, each meticulously packed. They toured factories producing shells by the thousands, inspected training grounds where even reserve gunners rehearsed complex fire missions with mathematical discipline. For men raised on notions of German technical superiority, the revelation was devastating. Otto Schmidt, once a veteran gunner in Tunisia, wrote from a Texas POW camp, "We were told that Americans were brave but clumsy, that their machines did the fighting for them. Now I see that their machines fight because their minds have built them to fight better than ours. They defeated us not through courage alone, but through organization and abundance. They could fire 100 shells where we fired one." This confession captured the broader truth that historians and economists would later document the victory of industrial modernity over militarized romanticism. Nazi Germany had built its identity around the myth of the superior soldier, the individual hero mastering the battlefield through will and skill. The United States built its war around the opposite idea that the collective power of trained citizens armed with mass production and scientific method would always overwhelm individual genius. In post-war interviews, even senior German generals conceded the point. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, wrote, "American artillery achieved what we believed impossible. They transformed it from a supporting arm into the decisive weapon of modern war. Their fire control logistics and coordination created a force that no enemy could match. Under its weight, our armies disintegrated." That disintegration was more than tactical, it was symbolic. The collapse of the German front in 1945 marked the end of an age where wars could be won by audacity or instinct. From then on, victory would belong to those who mastered systems, production systems, communication systems, data systems. It was not coincidence that in the same year, the first electronic computers were being tested in Philadelphia machines, designed originally to compute artillery trajectories faster than human mathematicians could. What began as a wartime necessity became the dawn of the information era. The same logic that directed shells over the Ardennes would soon guide the algorithms of modern warfare industry and economics. In the words of one U.S. ordnance officer reflecting years later, artillery wasn't just the thunder of guns. It was the sound of civilization learning how to organize chaos. By May 1945, the thunder finally ceased. The Reich surrendered. The factories that had armed America shifted back to civilian life, producing cars instead of cannons, consumer goods instead of shells. But the lessons of the artillery war endured, engraved in doctrine, technology, and the collective memory of every soldier who had heard that sound and survived. For the German veterans who lived to tell their stories, the fear never fully faded. When asked in a 1960 interview what weapon he feared most, Kurt Zimmermann, the artillery sergeant who had endured countless barrages, answered without hesitation, "Not tanks, not planes." It was the American artillery, the suddenness, the precision, the certainty. You could not see it, you could not stop it. One moment you were alive, the next nothing remained. It was more than a memory of fire, it was the recognition of inevitability. The artillery that shattered the forests of Belgium and the plains of Germany was not merely a weapon of war. It was the manifestation of a new global order, one built on coordination, computation, and capacity without limit. In that sense, the guns of 1945 did more than end a world war. They announced the beginning of a new one, the war of systems fought not for territory, but for the mastery of complexity itself. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe lay in ruins, and yet amid the ashes, a new kind of power had been born. The American artillery system that had crushed the Wehrmacht was not simply a triumph of firepower. It was the living embodiment of a civilization that had learned how to weaponize organization. It marked the point where war ceased to be an art of heroic improvisation and became a science of integrated systems. The defeated German officers who sat in their prison huts across Britain and the United States found themselves haunted by that realization. Their war diaries, letters, and post-war interrogations all echoed the same refrain. We were defeated by process. What had once been the pride of Prussian tradition, discipline, precision, the professional soldier's skill, had been eclipsed by something larger, colder, and infinitely more efficient. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, the diarist whose words had opened the story in the snowbound Ardennes, survived captivity in an Illinois POW camp. His final entry, dated August 1945, reflected a complete transformation of belief. We were told the Americans were amateurs, soldiers of commerce who fought for pay and not for honor. But we have seen their power. Their courage is not born of desperation, but of certainty. They fight knowing that behind them stands a machine that cannot fail. Müller's reflection was not poetic exaggeration, it was geopolitical truth. The United States had demonstrated that the foundation of modern warfare lay in the same pillars that underpinned modern economies: scale coordination and standardization. Every shell fired in Europe represented not only a military decision, but the strength of a national supply chain that stretched from the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh to the foundries of Detroit. German post-war economists studying the collapse of the Reich called it a production defeat. According to research later cited by the World Bank and Rand Corporation, the U.S. economy in 1944 had outproduced Germany's by a factor of 10 in total war material and more than 20 in artillery ammunition alone. America's industrial base was so vast that it could afford to fight 2 global wars at once, resupplying not only its own armies, but those of Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. To German generals who had once believed in the superiority of intellect and will, this was unbearable. We lost not on the battlefield, but in the factory, wrote General Heinz Guderian in a private memorandum for Allied interrogators. The Americans fought a war of industry, and industry never tires. Even in defeat, many German officers could not fully comprehend the scale of the machine that had consumed them. When taken on tours of American training grounds, they saw batteries of howitzers practicing coordinated fire missions with mathematical precision. Every gunner from corporal to lieutenant performed with the discipline of a production line worker. It was, as one observer remarked, Fordism applied to destruction. But perhaps the most profound revelation came not on the battlefield, but in the archives. When Allied researchers and captured German scientists began to examine how the U.S. artillery network functioned, they discovered the hidden genius behind its speed pre-computation. Every firing table, every trajectory correction, every meteorological adjustment had been calculated long before the shell was fired. It was as if the Americans had pre-written the war in numbers and only needed to read from the script. Professor Hoffman, now a prisoner of war, wrote his final technical report in April 1945 for American intelligence officers. His conclusion was blunt and prophetic. The Americans have mechanized thinking itself. Where we rely on instinct, they rely on predetermined logic. Their method cannot fail because it is not human, it is systemic. That phrase, mechanized thinking, would echo through the corridors of academia and defense research for decades. It captured the essence of what would soon become the defining principle of the post-war world: automation. The very same concepts that made American artillery so devastating: data integration, predictive computation, and feedback loops, were soon applied to other domains: logistics, finance, governance. The rise of the modern information state was born in those fire direction centers, where operators learned to translate human observation into coded coordinates, then back into physical destruction. When the Cold War dawned, the lessons of the artillery war became the blueprint for deterrence. Rand analysts in the 1950s, studying how to manage nuclear arsenals, directly cited the coordination models of the U.S. field artillery. The doctrine of responsive fire evolved into mutually assured destruction. The same synchronization that had once guided howitzers now guided missile silos. Even Eisenhower, reflecting years later, recognized the continuity. In a 1958 speech, he stated, "The miracle of coordination that brought victory in Europe is the same principle that must now prevent the next war. Our strength lies in our organization, the system that unites science industry and the soldier." Meanwhile, in Europe, the physical evidence of that system still scarred the landscape. Forests near Bastogne-Saint-Vith and Uffalise remained pocked with shell craters decades later, each one a small signature of an industrial empire that had reshaped the land itself. To historians of the late 20th century, the artillery war came to symbolize more than just the triumph of American arms. It represented the end of the old world order. The empires that had ruled through aristocratic tradition and martial elitism were swept aside by a republic of engineers, accountants, and logisticians. In this new order, victory belonged to whoever could compute, faster produce more, and move information more efficiently. This transformation was not lost on Germany's surviving officers. In post-war interrogations compiled by the U.S. Army Historical Division, one recurring phrase appeared again and again: "We were out-administered." It was perhaps the most damning admission in military history. The Americans had shown that efficiency itself was a weapon, one that could destroy entire armies without ever firing a shot in anger. Every truck that arrived on time, every shell that landed within a meter, every radio transmission that avoided static was part of an invisible machinery of victory. In this sense, the story of American artillery is not just the story of the Battle of the Bulge or even of World War II. It is the story of the 20th century itself. It is the moment when the logic of industry conquered the chaos of war. When Hans Müller returned home after the war, he found a Germany unrecognizable. The cities were rubble, the armies gone, the myth of superiority shattered. Yet in his final diary entry, written before his death in 1951, he captured the essence of what he and millions had witnessed. "We feared their shells, but what we truly feared was what they represented, a world that had learned to think faster than we could fight." His words marked the closing chapter of one era and the beginning of another. The thunder that once rolled across the Ardennes did not fade into silence. It evolved, echoing through factories, universities, and command centers for generations to come. The artillery that had broken the German war machine had also fired the opening salvo of a new kind of conflict, the global competition for technological supremacy. And in that war, the war of innovation, computation, and scale, the United States would remain the dominant force for decades. It was not the roar of tanks or the flight of bombers that defined the modern age. It was the steady, rhythmic pulse of artillery, the sound of industrial logic enforcing order on the battlefield and ultimately on the world itself. In the calm that followed 1945, the legacy of American artillery became more than a military study. It became a doctrine for civilization itself. Across Europe and Asia, nations rebuilding from the wreckage of war studied how the United States had achieved not just victory, but predictable victory. It was not improvisation that had broken the Axis. It was methodology, an approach so consistent, so mathematically grounded, that it bordered on inevitability. To the strategists of the New World Order, this realization changed everything. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe, the logistics networks that supplied it, and even the birth of multinational corporations all traced their operational DNA back to the same wartime logic that had governed American artillery. Coordination, standardization, and relentless efficiency were no longer just military virtues. They were economic imperatives. For historians, this marked a profound shift in human power. The 19th century had belonged to the individual, the great general, the daring inventor, the inspired statesman, The 20th century now belonged to the system. Whether in war or peace, victory belonged to those who mastered complexity. In post-war Germany, officers who had once commanded divisions now became analysts for NATO advisors for the Bundeswehr, or contributors to the U.S. Army's Operational Research Office. They dissected their own defeat with almost scientific detachment. The consensus was striking: German tactical excellence had been defeated by American operational integration. One colonel wrote in a 1948 report for the U.S. Historical Division, "We fought battles. The Americans fought a process. The process was unstoppable because it was scalable. What had once required elite officers with years of combat experience could now be achieved by ordinary soldiers using pre-computed data radio coordination and clear doctrine." The industrial democracy of the United States had created the world's first truly democratized army, a force where competence was engineered into every layer, not concentrated at the top. That democratization extended to the very philosophy of warfare. In Europe, artillery had always been seen as the general's instrument, precise, deliberate, almost aristocratic in its control. The Americans stripped it of that exclusivity. Artillery became a service to the infantry, responsive and immediate, empowering junior officers to wield destructive power once reserved for entire corps. Rand historian Charles Osgood later wrote, "The American artillery system was the first in history to embody the principle of empowerment by procedure. It trusted ordinary soldiers to perform extraordinary acts because the system around them made error almost impossible." In other words, it wasn't genius that made the system work, it was design. This design philosophy became the cornerstone of post-war American doctrine, spreading beyond the battlefield. The same structured communication feedback loops and redundancy that defined the Fire Direction Center found their way into corporate management models, aerospace engineering, and even computer architecture. The ENIAC computer, completed in 1946, was originally built to compute artillery firing tables faster than human computers could. But within a few years, its principles would transform everything from finance to space exploration. The first digital algorithms, the first weather simulations, even the first nuclear targeting models, all owed their existence to lessons learned from how artillery had coordinated its fire. As military historian Martin von Creveld observed decades later, the American artillery system of World War II did more than win battles. It mechanized the act of decision itself. The reverberations of that mechanization could be felt far beyond the war's end. When NATO formed in 1949, its very structure mirrored the U.S. artillery model: decentralized execution under centralized coordination, rapid communication across standardized systems, interoperability between diverse units, all born from the same logic that had unified American firepower across continents. Even adversaries took note. Soviet planners, alarmed by how swiftly U.S. artillery had adapted to dynamic conditions, began studying how to replicate its speed through command automation. The first Soviet artillery computers in the 1950s were direct descendants of captured Allied systems and technical manuals. In both superpowers, the race to automate decision-making had begun. This was the dawn of the information age, born not in Silicon Valley, but in the snowy forests of Belgium. In those same forests where Hans Müller once wrote of his terror under the American barrages, the trees began to regrow over the shell craters. Local villagers spoke for years about how the ground seemed to breathe after rain, how unexploded shells still buried deep beneath the soil would sometimes detonate decades later. Reminders of a war that had never truly gone silent. The Americans had left behind more than destruction. They had left a model for how to command the modern world. Every round fired every target, destroyed every synchronization achieved, was a rehearsal for the global systems that would define the post-war century. The military-industrial complex, the global supply chain, the digital network. For the soldiers who had fought beneath that thunder, the realization came slowly. In 1960, Kurt Zimmerman, now living as an immigrant in Wisconsin, was interviewed for a local veterans project. His words were simple, but profound. It was not hate that destroyed us. It was efficiency. The Americans fought as if every man and machine were part of the same thought. We fought as if each man still thought for himself. Zimmerman's reflection captured the essence of the 20th century's transformation, the replacement of individual brilliance with collective coordination. In war, as in industry, the new gods were systems, and systems did not sleep. When Rand published its study, The Systemization of War in 1964, it drew a direct line from the U.S. artillery's fire direction network to the emerging fields of computer science logistics theory and nuclear deterrence. The researchers noted that what had begun as a tactical advantage had evolved into a civilizational model, a blueprint for how an entire society could think, act, and produce as one unified mechanism. In this sense, the artillery's triumph in World War II was not just an American victory. It was humanity's first full demonstration of cybernetic warfare, the feedback-driven fusion of man-machine and information. And so the thunder of 1944 became the hum of 1949, the transition from cannon fire to data flow. From that moment onward, the nations that learned to think in systems to predict and coordinate at scale would dominate both war and peace. For the Germans who survived it was a lesson etched as deeply as any scar that courage without coordination was useless, and that precision without power meant nothing. For the Americans, it was proof that the future would belong not to the strongest or the bravest, but to the most organized. As one war correspondent wrote in the final months of 1945, the German soldier fought with courage. The American soldier fought with a calculator behind him, and that made all the difference. From the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes to the bright laboratories of the post-war United States, the line was unbroken. The battlefield that had once glowed with the light of exploding shells now glowed with something new, the dawn of the computational age. The thunder that ended the old world had become the signal that began the new one,